The Unpaid Ledger. Season 2, Episode 11. The Door. The gaps had been getting closer together. 3 Tuesdays ago, I'd sat down at my desk at 8 in the morning and looked up to find it was 3 in the afternoon, and the coffee was cold. There was a completed intake form in my handwriting that I had no memory of filling out. A client named Harmon. Called twice, left 2 messages. I'd handled both calls, made notes, filed the notes. April confirmed it, and the work was real. I just hadn't been home for it. That was the biggest one. The others were smaller, an hour here, a half hour there, conversations I remembered starting and not finishing. I'd been mid-sentence with Marcus once and come back to myself to find the sentence was done, and he'd been waiting politely for a response. He hadn't mentioned it. That was worse than if he had. The drain was taking what it needed when I worked, and a little extra when I didn't. I'd been tracking it for 6 weeks, and the direction was clear enough that I didn't need Marcus to confirm the picture. He'd confirmed it anyway, with the specific tone of a man who had relevant historical data and wished he didn't. The progression went names first, then faces, then the person you'd been before all of this. He'd given me Vidal as the precedent, a practitioner from Buenos Aires. Story with no ending because the people who'd known the ending hadn't survived to write it down. I thanked him for the historical perspective. He told me not to be clever about it. I told him I'd try 2 weeks ago. Managing it meant working less, which meant April had been filtering the intake without being asked. She kept a running list on yellow legal paper, names presenting problems. Referral sources, left on the corner of my desk each morning and removed each night without comment. I'd watched her handwriting get tighter as the weeks went on. That was how April registered unhappy, and I'd been leaving the list alone. The plan was Elmwood Cemetery that night, an hour before midnight. The cemetery was the strongest natural cost sink in Ashford, 140 years of accumulated weight in the ground. Old costs settled deep and slow, the kind of density that would pull with me instead of against me. I'd been there twice before, once for a case, once for what Marcus called surface contact with the anchor. Tonight I was going further. The anchor was a structure the gray space had built to keep Eddie stable, using me as the foundation. Drawing on that foundation constantly and taking a little extra with every draw. The only way to stop the drain was to find where it attached to me and shift it. Surface contact had shown me the shape of the thing. Tonight I needed the connection point. The risk was the bracelet. Every time I worked at depth. Mortimer ran loud, and loud was the signal the hunter had been following for 4 months. It wanted what was in the vessel. Going deep near Eddie meant the bracelet would spike, and the hunter would track the spike straight to the passenger seat. I needed Mortimer quiet, and I needed distance. I told Eddie at 6:30 with April gone. "I'm going to Elmwood tonight," I said. To try the anchor, deeper than before. He was at his window, the east one, the one that looked toward the river. He turned around and waited, because he already knew the next part. "You want me to stay in the car," he said. "Bracelet goes loud near you. I need it quiet for this." He asked, "How long?" and I said 20 minutes, maybe 30. He gave me the expression he used when the math was done, and the answer was what it was. "Fine," he said. We drove to Elmwood in the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, just the city doing its Tuesday. The Taurus's heater working for once. February holding at a temperature cold enough to clear the streets. I took the good light route north. Eddie watched the city from his side. We'd driven these streets enough times that neither of us needed to fill the space. The cemetery's parking area was a strip of gravel inside the gate. Room for 6 cars. And we were the only ones there. I cut the engine. Mortimer was warm against my wrist, the low-level ambient register it ran near cost concentrations. And the cemetery was full of them, old and settled. Exactly what I needed. 30 minutes, I said. "Don't touch the radio." He gave me the look that meant he'd heard me. "I'm serious about the radio." "I know you're serious about the radio," Eddie said. "Go do your thing." I got out. The February night was cold and specific, the kind of cold that was honest rather than punishing. That told you exactly what it was without making a point of it. I stood on the gravel for a moment with Mortimer warming toward the density in the ground, and the Taurus behind me and Eddie in the passenger seat. And I thought about what I was leaving there, and then I walked toward the gate. The bench by the east wall was where I'd worked before on the nights that had required Elmwood, old fieldstone. 40 years of weather on it, facing a row of markers from the early part of the last century. The names were mostly illegible now. I'd looked at them often enough to know their shapes without being able to read them, which felt like the right relationship to have with the cemetery. I sat down and reached. The cemetery's cost density ran deep and old and slow. Sitting in it was like sitting in something that had decided a long time ago to be patient, and the patience had accumulated into its own weight. I let the sink pull against the anchor, the way I'd learned to use what the environment offered instead of working against it. The difference from the previous attempts was immediate. The anchor was clearer than it had ever been, not surface contact this time. I was past the outer structure, inside the architecture. What I found was specific, built with the kind of precision that goes into work meant to last. 7 years of accumulation had given the gray space time to adapt, to reinforce the load-bearing pieces, to shape the structure around what it had found. The anchor knew my shape, the way a worn tool knows the hand that uses it. I pushed straight at the structure, and it held without effort. I tried tracing an edge back instead, following one route toward its source, slower work. The sink kept pulling with me, old settled costs in the ground, shifting in patient sympathy. I held the trace through 2 false starts before I found the first real attachment point. It was in me. I'd known the anchor was using me as foundation. That was the whole problem. What I hadn't known was how specific the attachment was. Not anchored to me generally, anchored to a particular part of how I worked. The constant awareness of where Eddie was. The part that had always known his location without effort, every hour, every day, since the river. The gray space had found the most stable structure available and built around it. Of course it had. I pushed against the attachment, and the anchor had not moved. I had, or something in me had. The force I'd pushed into the connection point came back through the bracelet, clean and bright and wrong. The signal went out in every direction. Not a flare, not a warning, a confession. Somewhere in the city, the hunter heard me say exactly where I was. And worse than that, exactly where Eddie was. I came out of the attempt fast. Reflex, not decision. I sat on the bench with the February air cold on my face and Mortimer burning on my wrist and the night entirely still. Then the bracelet's pull shifted direction. Not inward, not toward the anchor, but outward, toward the parking area and the Taurus. I was on my feet before I'd finished understanding why. Chapter 2. The gate was 150 yards from the bench. I ran it. Mortimer was pulling toward the car with the insistence it used on active placements, that directional drag, locked and certain. But the bracelet had never flagged Eddie like this. He registered as background, known and constant, below the threshold it bothered tracking. Right now it was treating him like a live placement on a stranger. I ran. The problem I had while running, if I cut Mortimer's output entirely, I lost contact with the gray space. Eddie was in the pocket and I was the tether. And a cold tether meant he was in the in-between without anything on my end. If I stayed lit, I was broadcasting, drawing the hunter toward the car with every second. There was no option that didn't make something worse. I stayed lit and ran harder. The gate was wrought iron, one side propped open on a rock the city left there. I went through without slowing and hit the gravel of the parking area. The Taurus was where I'd left it, The only car in the lot. Nothing visible. But Morimer was flagging something that wasn't Eddie and wasn't the cemetery's background density and wasn't any placement I'd ever worked. It was reading heavy, heavier than the foundry work that had put the bracelet on my wrist. Heavier than the Harlow pull. Heavier than anything. The hunter had been following my signal for 4 months. I'd just given it the single loudest event in that entire span from 150 yards away. I got to the driver's door and pulled it open. Eddie was in the passenger seat, and he hadn't moved. His hands were in his lap, and his expression was the specific look of someone who had been holding very still for a deliberate reason and had been doing it long enough to get good at it. I got in and didn't touch the ignition. "Hold on," I said. I ran Morimer at full output. Not a pull, not a dissipation, nothing I'd been trained to do with it. Just broadcast everything, point blank, aimed at whatever the bracelet was flagging outside the car. The hunter had been following the lighthouse for months. I gave it the lighthouse at close range and full power. Enough signal at that proximity that nothing could read a direction through the noise. 4 seconds, maybe 5. The bracelet ran hotter than I'd ever deliberately pushed it. And then the outward pull dropped and Morimer went quiet, and the night outside was entirely ordinary again. The hunter had backed off, not gone, but back. I put my forehead against the steering wheel. The transaction heat bled off my arm in its own time. My hand had the feeling of having held something very cold for too long, not painful. Just depleted in a way that went past the muscle. Outside, the cemetery's east wall was visible over the lot's edge. The bench somewhere back in the dark on the other side of it. When I straightened up, Eddie was watching me. "Tell me what happened while I was gone," I said. He took a breath, didn't need to, but did it when he was organizing something. "First couple of minutes, nothing unusual," he said. "Cemetery background, the anchor running, the bracelet warm the way it is when you're nearby." Then the signal went loud. He'd felt that from the gray space side like a lamp turning on in the next room. Right after that, the pressure moved. The thing that's been out there for months, tracking from outside, came toward me fast. He'd recognized it. The hunter had been ambient for weeks, something circling the outer edge of the pocket from a distance. This wasn't circling. I held still, he said. My sense was that moving wasn't the right response. I can't explain exactly why. It just wasn't. His hands were still in his lap, fingers loosely curled, not clenched, just held there, like he'd stopped himself halfway through reaching for something and decided against it. "Did it touch you?" I said. "No." He looked at the windshield instead of at me, but it found the outside of where I am. He'd been right to hold still, but I didn't say it. Then the caller came. While the hunter was pressing on the outside, and you were gone. I could feel the tether running, but nothing at your end. It was just there. No build-up, no frequency through the radio first. Clear. He looked out the windshield. I think the hunter pressing created the opening. The wall that normally keeps the signal down to a drone. Whatever you do when you're nearby that keeps it from getting through clean, the hunter was pushing on that wall from the outside at the same moment you weren't on the other side of it. And the caller used that. He paused. Every other time it's come through, it's been like hearing something through a wall. You know there's a voice, but you can't make out the words. Tonight, there was no wall. 5 minutes with no wall while you were running, and it used every second. I asked what it showed him. Not words, he said. More like, you know when you walk into a room you've never been in and you understand immediately what the room is for? You don't need anyone to explain it. The function is in the shape of the thing. He looked at his hands. It showed me what it is. It was a person, once, not recently, a very long time ago. Long enough that what's left isn't quite a person anymore. Just the pattern one leaves behind when the person is gone long enough. But the pattern still knows what it was. He paused. and it wanted me to know the door is open. That I don't have to stay. The February night sat outside the windows. Beyond the gate, somewhere past the cemetery wall, a car moved through an intersection, headlights briefly visible then gone. I asked what he'd told it. I didn't tell it anything, Eddie said. I sat with those 4 words and what was in the gap they left. You came back. Was not. I said no. Eddie knew I knew that. He wasn't pretending otherwise. He'd told me the exact true thing and left the gap in it, visible, because that was how he operated when he didn't want to lie to me and wasn't ready to say the rest of it yet. Are you thinking about it? I said. He was quiet long enough that the quiet answered. I don't know yet, he said. I know what it's offering. I don't know what going through a door that old costs, or what's on the other side, or what it means. He turned and looked at me. I've been here 7 years. I'm not going anywhere tonight. But the door's there. And I saw it clearly for the first time. And now I know it's a door and not just a sound. He held my eyes. I'm allowed to know that. He was. I didn't have an argument against it. The only case I had was that I wanted him in the passenger seat. And that wasn't an argument. It was just a fact I'd been carrying around without putting it into words. He knew I was carrying it. That had been enough for a while. Yeah, I said. You are. We sat in the parking lot with the engine off. I was working through what it meant, that the caller had gotten 5 uninterrupted minutes with Eddie while I was running. And there was nothing I could do to make that not have happened. The door had existed before tonight. But before tonight, Eddie had been hearing a sound through a wall. And tonight he'd seen what the sound was coming from. Those were different things, and I didn't have a plan yet. I started the engine. The anchor didn't move, I said. I know. I got to the connection point. It's attached to how I track you. The part of me that always knows where you are, the gray space built the anchor into that. He was quiet for a moment. That's specific. Yeah, Marcus is going to find that very interesting. Marcus, Eddie said, is going to find that terrifying and call it interesting. It was the first thing either of us had said without weight in it. I held on to it for the drive. Chapter 3. I tried Marcus from the car on the way to the river road. It went to voicemail, his recorded message, unhurried, asking me to leave a number and a brief description of the matter. I left the connection point detail in 40 seconds and hung up. He'd call back when he called back. He called back at 10:28. The anchor is attached to your positional awareness of him, Marcus said. No preamble. He'd listened to the voicemail twice, probably. Not to you, generally, to the specific mechanism that has always known where he is. That's what I found. Young man. He took a breath. That is not a design choice the gray space made lightly. Structural anchors look for permanence. Your awareness of Eddie's location has been the single most permanent thing in your working life for 7 years. The gray space didn't choose that arbitrarily. It chose it because nothing else came close. I drove. What does that mean for breaking it? I said. It means breaking it is not a matter of finding the right force and applying it. It is a matter of understanding what you'd be severing and what lives downstream of that severance. He was quiet for a moment. The tracking doesn't just tell you where he is. It may be part of how the pocket itself remains coherent. Disrupt the tracking imprecisely, and you may not be breaking the anchor. You may be destabilizing something that has been holding for 7 years without your understanding of how. So surface direction won't do it. Surface direction will not do it. Marcus confirmed. You need to understand the full load path before you touch the connection point again. Where the tracking draws from. Where the anchor distributes its weight to. What is being balanced against what? He paused. This is not work you do alone. I know. I'm told you've been in contact with Leland about the anchor mapping. I hadn't told him that. How do you know that? Because I suggested it to her 3 weeks ago, Marcus said. In the tone he used when he was being matter-of-fact about something he'd expected to be a problem. She has instruments I don't have. You have access I don't have. The two of you together may have enough to see the full load path. I am not telling you to trust her. I'm telling you the alternative is moving the anchor blind and hoping. You suggested this 3 weeks ago without telling me. I was working up to it, Marcus said. You were managing well enough to have options. Tonight's event has removed some of those options. He was not wrong. I told him about the hunter's clock. He was quiet for a moment in a way that meant he was absorbing it. Tomorrow, he said, after you see Leland, call me. I told him I would, and we hung up. The call dropped, and the car filled with the absence of it. I was on Crescent without a destination, just away from Elmwood, which was where I needed to be for a few miles. Ashford at 10:30, a bus grinding east on its last run of the night. A laundromat still lit. 2 people outside a bar not quite deciding to leave. I drove through all of it. Marcus's words sat in the car with me. Not the part about load paths and instruments. The part underneath that the tracking might not just be an anchor mechanism. It might be part of what kept Eddie here at all. If the pocket destabilized, the thing it was stabilizing would not have a stable place to be. I ran that one clean through without putting a floor under it, which was the only honest way to run it. Leland called at 10:43. I was on Crescent heading east without a destination, just away from Elmwood, which was where I'd needed to be for a few miles. Her number was on the screen and I picked up. Mr. Vance. No preliminary. I've been reviewing tonight's sensor data. 2 things. Go ahead. The first is a timeline. Tonight's bracelet event at Elmwood was the largest output I've recorded in 4 months. I heard her turn a page. Larger than the Harlow work. Larger than the Elmwood snapback by a measurable margin. At that output level, the hunter's locate window has moved from weeks to days. Not several days. She let that land without softening it. I want you to understand that clearly. I took my hand off the wheel and put it back. Mortimer was cold on my wrist, fully ambient, no transaction heat, just wearing. It didn't know yet what I'd just been told. I let that sit for a second. The second thing, she said. I've been working the anchor problem separately. Not because you asked, because the anchor is part of what my instruments have been reading. And I've spent 3 months trying to understand what I'm looking at. She chose the next words carefully. I have a partial map of the anchor, structure. Not enough to break it alone. But if you can tell me what you found, tonight at the connection point. What I have and what you found may build into something neither of us has on its own. Outside, a traffic light ran its cycle for an empty intersection. I drove through on green. You've been working the anchor problem for 3 months, I said. Yes. Without mentioning it. Correct. 3 months of parallel work on the central problem while I'd been treating, the arrangement as a one-direction exchange. She'd been running a third line I hadn't known about. I didn't know if that was the arrangement she'd agreed to, or a version of it she'd decided on her own to extend. With Leland, the distinction probably mattered less than she'd argue it did. I wasn't angry. I was tired, my arm still ached from the bracelet burn. And anger wasn't something I could spend right now. I'll call you tomorrow, I said. I'll be available. No ceremony. She'd have the files ready, and that was the whole call. I hung up. I drove south on Mercer and east on the River Road, Ashford settling into its late night around me. Mortimer was cold now, fully ambient, the transaction heat long gone. Somewhere in the city, the hunter was reading the signal drop and running its timeline with tonight's numbers. Days. I pulled over where the embankment dropped down to the water and the east side's lights made the river look like it was going somewhere specific. I'd been ending up on this stretch often enough that I'd stopped asking why. The math was clear and it was bad. The anchor hadn't moved. The hunter had a shorter clock than this morning. The caller had gotten 5 uninterrupted minutes with Eddie, and Eddie had looked at the door and said he didn't know yet. I couldn't leave Eddie alone without the hunter using the gap. I couldn't work cases at the pace I'd been working without the drain taking more. I couldn't break the anchor alone. I just proved that at the bench in front of the old stones. Leland had 3 months of anchor analysis I hadn't known about. Marcus had known she was working it and had suggested the approach 3 weeks ago. Both of them had been running lines I hadn't known about. And I was the one with the gray space access. The reasons were clear enough, and I didn't have to like it. But the math was the math. I'd run it alone for months and the answer hadn't changed. What I needed was the map, and the map required Leland. I picked up the phone and called her back. She answered on the first ring. "Send me what you have," I said. "Already sending." Keystrokes. "I'd recommend meeting tomorrow afternoon. Parts of the map are easier to explain with the visual in front of us." Fine. The connection point. I looked at the river. The anchor is attached to how I track him. The part of me that always knows where he is, the gray space built the anchor into that. A silence longer than her usual ones. "That changes the map considerably," she said. I thought it might. "Tomorrow, 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock. I hung up. The river kept moving the way it had before I'd learned to do any of this. Before the bridge, before Eddie. It would keep moving after, and I used to find that depressing. Lately, it was more useful than that. I put the car in drive. Chapter 4. We drove home with the radio on. Not the gray space frequency, the ordinary AM station, the overnight program about local zoning disputes. The host had the voice of someone who had decided to be calm about everything and was holding that decision at midnight. Neither of us had any investment in the zoning situation. But we'd been following it for 3 months, and it felt wrong to stop now. We let it run. I was thinking through what Marcus had said. The tracking might not just point me toward Eddie. It might be part of what kept him here. Which meant breaking the anchor wrong wouldn't just leave the drain running, it might pull the floor out from under him. I hadn't let myself sit with that at full weight yet. My arm still had the deep ache from the bracelet burn and the running and the full output push in the parking lot. And there was a version of sitting with it that I wasn't going to be useful after. I filed it for tomorrow and drove. I drove. Eddie watched the city from his side. The zoning program continued. "The attachment to your tracking," Eddie said after a mile. "Does that bother you?" "Not the way you mean." "What way do I mean?" "The way where the gray space, using something specific without asking, is a problem." I made the turn onto my block. The gray space doesn't ask. It built with what was stable. "And the other way?" I parked in front of the building and cut the engine. "The other way," I said. "It makes sense. The part of me that always knows. Where you are was the most permanent piece. Of course the gray space found it. Of course it built around it." I looked at the building. "Marcus says the tracking may be holding the pocket together. That moving it without the full load path could destabilize more than the drain." Eddie was quiet for a moment. "He told you that tonight. Just now. On the river road, before I called Leland back. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. I watched him take that in, the specific quality of someone hearing news about their own situation and deciding how to hold it. Whatever he was feeling, he wasn't showing me the whole of it. Which was fine, and neither was I. So Marcus is worried. He considered this. That's Marcus saying he's worried in Marcus. That's what it is, I said. That's going to make Leland very uncomfortable, he said. Leland has had 3 months of anchor work she didn't tell me about. And Marcus apparently suggested she approach me 3 weeks ago and didn't tell me that either. I'm starting to feel like I'm the last person informed about what's happening in my own gray space. You were the last person in the cemetery, Eddie said. At least you have that. I got out and stood on the sidewalk. February night, cold and still, the street empty in both directions. Eddie came up beside me. I need to say something, he said. I waited. The caller. What it showed me tonight. He looked at the building, then at me. I'm not making a decision about it tonight or tomorrow. I want you to know that clearly. But I can't pretend the door isn't there because we both know it is. And I need to be able to sit with that without it being treated as an emergency. It's not an emergency, I said. He looked at me for a moment. You mean that? I mean it. He seemed to actually take that in, not the word I meant it, but whatever he could see in my face that matched it. It was the kind of thing you couldn't fake, and we both knew it, so I didn't try. Okay, he said. We went inside. Up the stairs, past the second floor where Mrs. Adiemi's television was still on at this hour. Past the landing where the overhead light had been out for 3 weeks, and the building manager had gotten my 2 polite notes and ignored them. Familiar ground. 7 years of the same stairs, the same landing, the same sequence of locks on my door. Eddie went through the wall to his side of the arrangement, which was the gray space equivalent of hanging up a coat, and I went in through the door the regular way and turned on the kitchen light. Leland's files were there when I opened the laptop. 3 documents and a sensor log going back to the Elmwood snapback. I went through them at the table, slowly enough to absorb what she'd built. She had the exterior map, 3 months of it. The anchor's load distribution read from the outside. Every location where I'd worked. I had the interior attachment. Together it was something neither of us could have drawn alone. And Marcus had told me that was exactly what I needed before I touched the connection point again. I sat at the table for a minute after I closed the laptop, not processing, just sitting. The apartment and the building were quiet. February at midnight was doing what it did, which was hold still and let things catch up to themselves. I closed the files and went to the window. Ashford at midnight, streetlights doing what they could. Apartment windows mostly dark. The river somewhere east past the buildings. 11 years of looking at this city from this window. Tonight it didn't just look like where I lived. It looked like something I'd been carrying for a long time. And was going to keep carrying. Because there wasn't a version of any of this where I put it down. I stood there for a while, not working through anything, just standing, and I'd found the connection point tonight. Marcus had the call about load paths and structure. Leland had 3 months of exterior map that fit what I'd found from the inside. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock those 2 halves were going to be in the same room for the first time. And I'd find out if they assembled into something usable or something worse. From the other room I heard Eddie settle at his window, the east-facing one, toward the river. He was quiet over there, and I was quiet over here. Separate rooms. Same direction. That had been us for a while. He'd been in that apartment almost as long as I had. In the passenger seat of the Taurus since before it had 200,000 miles on it. 7 years, and I still felt the difference in the rooms. The radio was off. I hadn't turned it on since we came upstairs. Eddie had seen the door, but he had not walked through it. I went to bed. Tonight. That was enough.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.